everybody. I'm Karl Wells, and welcome to Summer Scene today from St. John's. This year, or last year actually, VONF and then CBC Radio in Newfoundland celebrated its golden anniversary, 50 years of radio broadcasting in Newfoundland. So I thought today we'd talk about those golden days of radio in Newfoundland. And here with me to talk about the old days of radio is Harold Morris. Harold started out in 1945 with VONF as an announcer and worked for VONF and then CBC for, I guess, over 30 years. Was it, Harold?
Around 32 years, yeah.
Harold, back when you started, what did a person have to be to make it as a radio announcer?
Well, really, there was no such thing as an audition in the way we know it today. Actually, I went in and there was an operator there, and Mr. Galgi went in and sat in the control room and listened to me read a portion of the Doyle Bulletin. And on that, the decision was made that I was going to be hired.
So you didn't have to do any audition as such?
No, they didn't do any recording in those days of any amount, unless it was something that was really extra special. Because recording discs at that time, it was a very special operation, and it was expensive. Another thing, too, it was after the war, and they were using glass records, glass laminated with an acetate, and they would cut the discs. And therefore, they sort of confined themselves to doing a minimum amount of recording.
Was it basically the sound of your voice that...
Apparently, that was what did it, and I did have some little training, which I got in Santa Barbara, California, at a night school. So in that respect, I did have a little experience. But with that and his listening to me, apparently that was the decision or deciding factors.
You mentioned California. That makes me wonder, did you have any heroes in those days? Were people like Arthur Godfrey and Lowell Thomas heroes?
Well, for me personally, you're thinking of Lowell Thomas was certainly one of them that I always listened to Lowell Thomas. I thought he did a tremendous job on the news. And then, of course, there were Arthur Godfrey, and there was Fred Allen. His show was a great show, and I certainly enjoyed listening and hearing that program. And there were a few others, but primarily these were the ones that I was interested in. In those days, you didn't listen to radio quite the same as you did today. And another thing, too, is you were a very fortunate person if you had a radio in your car, which I didn't have, and this kind of thing. So, you know, and when you went home and listened to the radio, well, generally it was listening to the news or somebody's favorite programs. I remember my mother, for instance, she liked Ma Perkins, and my father liked Lum and Abner. And so when they were on, everybody sat down and listened.
Even back then,
didn't interfere.
Even back then, the lady of the house liked the soap operas, and the man of the house liked the comedy shows.
Very much so, and not only that, in those days, the average woman, as soon as the soap operas came on, like Ma Perkins and the others, why, they always picked up their knitting or their crocheting, and they did a portion of work. And I know my mother did several of these colorful patchwork covers, you know, that plus she did a lot of crocheting, beautiful crocheting. She used to do a little circle during a 15-minute program.
By the way, Harold, you mentioned these programs like Ma Perkins. Back then, you were airing some of those shows on VONF, weren't you?
That's right, so we were. Yeah, we carried, well, I don't remember them all, but I know we carried Ma Perkins, we carried Lum and Abner, and of course we had other shows like the Green Hornet, and let me see, the London, New York, and Paris, they sponsored a sort of a soap opera show which was quite popular. And then there were other programs. There were the Lone Ranger, Superman, and we had them all pretty well. And they came in on discs, in the 16-inch disc. and you had
a big...
Right, that was 16 inches, and you had a 15-minute program on one side, or you had 2 discs with a half-hour program, part 1 and part 2, right? And of course that gave you a break for a commercial in the center, so that the record was taken off and turned over.
Tell us a story about the little chap who came to the station one day wanting to meet the Lone Ranger.
Well, VONF, when we broadcast in VONF and we did our programs and what have you, well, we did it in a studio that it had a long window, and adjoining the studio was an observation room where guests of the hotel or any itinerant visiting or visitors could come up and sit down and hear the news or watch what was going on when it was going on. And of course there were always, the hotel was a focal point. We were on the top floor of the hotel, and it was a focal point for all activity, really. People visiting, coming, going, and anything that was going on in the way of government business or anything like that, well, people came and stayed there. But what I was going to say was that we had all sorts of visitors, but this night I was in studio, and this gentleman came from somewhere out of town, and he had his young fellow with him, and he just about bowled me over when he came and he introduced himself and told me he had brought his son along and that they wanted to see the Lone Ranger. They also wanted to see his horse Silver and Tonto. So you know, I didn't really know how to answer the man at first. And then I decided, well, I better explain to him what was what, and I did, and with that, I took him out in the library and showed him the discs and the programs and how it was done. And then I said, now, if you got time, what I'll do for you, where they were going back to their community, I said, I'll let you listen to a whole week's programs, or so many programs. I think it was 6 or 8 programs. They sat down, they were there all night, and I just played the program, but they went out of the studio thrilled with the fact that they knew ahead of time what was going to happen the next 5 or 6 weeks down the road, as against the average listener. So it was an interesting visit.
What other sorts of programming were you involved in?
Well, we did programs, for instance, when the Newfoundland Tuberculosis Association or the Blind Institute or any of these people were running their campaigns. Well, this was their only means of contact with people in the communities, and really they did tremendous work there, because they literally organized what was going on through radio. And they contacted their team captains and so on, and instructed them what to do. And the result was that you did introductions on these programs, and you sort of got involved with them. They took on different formats. Some were just plain talk, discussion. Others were done with a bit of music or a song or something like that. All talent, by the way, in those days was volunteer. There was no talent paid for.
Really?
No. In fact, when I joined VONF, I joined, and my pay at that time was $95 a month.
VONF was the government station.
That's right, yeah. It was, VONF became a government station, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 1932. That was a commission of government, and they formed what they call the Broadcasting Corporation of Newfoundland, and they formed it. They sort of made an organization on the basis of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the BBC, so we had a bit of both. Of course, that was natural in one sense of the word, because the country was being governed then by a commission of government, which I think consisted of 3 appointed commissioners and 3 appointed local people and the governor. So,
what were the other stations that were in existence at that time?
The other stations at that time, as far as well, at the time that I entered the field of broadcasting, it was VOCM, and then there was the Wesley radio station, VOWR, and also the Seventh-day Adventist. And of course, too, there was VOUS, the U.S. Army. and they allowed the American personnel to have their own radio station. It had limited coverage, but now in the meantime, we benefited tremendously by that, and Newfoundland people did too, because the Americans had detachments, and the Canadians had detachments stationed out around in various parts of the island. And they wanted their personnel to get these programs, so they made an arrangement with the Broadcasting Corporation of Newfoundland to air these programs. And of course, we were delighted to do it, because we got some great shows, Fibber McGee and Molly, and oh gosh, I don't know how many, the dance bands, and hair game, we got Fred Allen, we got Frank Benny, what's his name, Benny, and his show. Jack Benny, and I don't know how many more, but I know we used to get a raft of them. They'd come up, and we had our choice of the top programs in the United States, and they went over quite well too.
Who were some of the big broadcasting personalities back in those early days?
Well, one thing, when I arrived on the scene, I think the whole thing was in a state of transition, because we were on the verge of the National Convention, and Mr. Smallwood had left his Barrowman program, and Mike Harrington had taken over that. Al Vardy was still doing the Good Luck News. That was what it was known as then. It was Newfoundland Margarine Company.
So you had commercials on VONF?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, oh, definitely.
It wasn't commercial free?
No. We had commercials. And then, of course, Bob McLeod was a real personality, besides being an announcer. And of course, Aubrey Mack was a personality. There's no he still is. Then we had the Premier Pals. There was Marv Frelich and Mickey Andrews and Chrissy Andrews. There was Chrissy Andrews, and then Michael somebody or Mickey somebody, Mickey Andrews, I think. And then we had Jackie Walsh, the singing cowboy, and he worked. Jackie worked with the railway, but he came down and did a show every Saturday night, and he used to get barrels of mail because, of course, every time Jackie sang a song, he sang it for somebody in response to requests he got, and he was quite popular.
Did you have a lot of request-type programs?
Well, we did, in a sense. One program that was very popular, and we got a lot of requests for it, was the what they call the musical variety program, which was in the morning, and it was primarily for shut-ins. But now, in the meantime, everybody availed of it, and because you had people that had other relatives and friends that were sick in hospitals, and of course, in the meantime, they would write in a request to play for so-and-so who is in the general hospital, or so-and-so who is in the sanatorium, this number. And of course, you had then the people in the hospital writing and asking to play requests for their mother out in Kings Cove or something of that nature.
I guess that was one way of knowing how well you were doing, how many people you had
there
listening.
were no such things in those days as Nielsen ratings, and this was one method whereby you knew the popularity of the program, and you knew how well your reception was being received, how the program was being received. That brought there was a funny thing. There were several funny things. I mean, I wouldn't know. There were so many funny things happen. But there was one time that Bob McLeod got this letter, and this lady asked him. She told him how she had a pump organ, you know.
All right.
And anyway, and they had moved house, and it was stored. And finally, when she got in her new home, the stop buttons, little ivory buttons that told you what the stop was, had lost, in other words, dampness. They had dropped off. So she wrote Bob and requested Bob to send her the address whereby she could get new nameplates for the stop buttons. So Bob very kindly did that, and it was about 2 or 3 months later he got another letter in from her, and I was there when Bob opened it, and we nearly fell over because this lady was asking him if he would be kind enough on the program to tell her she had something like 9 or 12 stop button labels, and she was wondering if he'd be kind enough to tell her which buttons to put the nameplates on. So
over the air.
Bob just, and she wanted it done over the air, but there was no way Bob could do that anyway. So he wrote her a letter and explained to her what she should do.
Yeah.
She should get somebody, a school teacher, somebody had some knowledge to take care of it for her.
Yeah.
But
Harold, we've got some pictures of some of the boys from...
Some old memories.
Some old memories of the early days here. This first gentleman is Mr. Galgay himself.
Right, he was a very illustrious person. And he was a man that originally, he was the original announcer and really compiler of the Gerald S. Doyle Bulletin. And when he was on the air doing the bulletin, he was known as Frank L. Barkley, because in those days it was advisable to have a pseudonym and not use your own name.
The Doyle Bulletin, of course, everybody's familiar with, an institution in broadcasting in this province. Can you remember how it was introduced?
Oh, I think so. I'm pretty sure I can remember it. I'll try anyway.
Have a go.
One thing was, this is the way it was before Confederation. They changed it slightly after. But prior to Confederation, the introduction ran, "At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we present the Gerald S. Doyle Bulletin, bringing the news from all over Newfoundland, and brought to you tonight by Bayer Aspirin, the makers..." Well, I better start that. "At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you the Gerald S. Doyle Bulletin, brought to you tonight by the makers of Bayer Aspirin and S.J. Pretty and Sons, Dildo, Trinity Bay, where stocks of other Gerald S. Doyle products are always procurable."
Congratulations.
I should have had a script here on that.
I wouldn't have been able to remember that. Let's look at some more of these pictures.
I meant to tell you, too, when CBC took over, they cut out the ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, I see. Now, this gentleman is a well-known personality today, for sure.
He certainly is, and I remember him well.
This is John Murphy.
That's right, his honor.
His days with VOCM.
Mm-hmm.
And who do we have here?
And this is Douglas Brophy. And Douglas joined us prior to Confederation. When Doug joined us in Durham Breen, and when we joined Confederation, we had altogether 5 announcers. There was Aubrey Mack, Leo Thistle, myself, and Doug in Durham. This is John Holmes, and I think at that time he was working with VOCM.
As a news reporter, I think.
I believe so, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That was something else, too, that had quite an impact on radio in Newfoundland, was the coming of the London Theatre, because it gave us a new dimension in drama and acting.
John, of course, was with them when he
that's right,
when they came originally.
That's right. And they became, they played a pretty fair-sized role in our school broadcasts.
This is Don Jameson, of course.
So it is, and Muriel Mackay. And Muriel Mackay was the woman editor, I think, or news woman. And here we have Muriel Mackay again, and we have Jack White and Bren Walsh.
Jack White, of course, is a magistrate
He's a magistrate now, and Bren is retired, and Bren was working then with CJON.
That was the CJON newsroom, yeah.
No, he later came with us.
Here's,
and of course, this is the Honorable John Jameson again.
Pretty young version of Don Jameson,
that's
I must say.
Don Jameson was very active in those days, and he was a ball of energy. He also did a great amount of tremendous volunteer work, master of ceremonies on variety shows, you name it, he was in on it. Anything for a cause, he pushed it.
Here's
John Nolan, he was with CJON.
All right.
And of course, John Nolan, he's a judge now of our immigration court, I think.
Well,
that's yours truly.
Yes.
Still wearing a bow tie.
Yeah. Now, this gentleman...
this is Durham Breen.
We saw a few minutes ago, I think.
That's right. He's our producer on tonight's show. And Harry Brown. And of course, Harry Brown is on Take 30 now, isn't it? His big show.
That was in the CJON days.
And Leo Thistle. Leo Thistle was an announcer with us in VONF, and later became announcer with CBC and then a producer.
And we end up with
Aubrey Mack, the Dean of Sportscasters.
The one and only, and still on the air.
That's true. That's
Saturdays,
true.
I believe, on CBC Radio. Harold, I guess the highlight of those years really was the coverage of the National Convention.
Well, there is no doubt about it. It was a tremendous thing. And and of course it got all priority as far as broadcasting was concerned. With the advent of the National Convention, I went from St. John's out to Gander, and the radio station out there at that time was closed down. It was built by the servicemen, Canadian servicemen. It was closed down and we reactivated it. And actually we had then what was primarily the beginning of a network service. That's a daily network service in Newfoundland, where we were linked up with St. John's, Gander, and then Grand Falls, and also Corner Brook.
That's when it all began. Harold, we've run out of time.
Well, we'll have to come back another time.
Thank you very much for being here today.
It's been a real pleasure, Carl. Real pleasure.
Thank you for watching.